You picked the heart. More fighting in the Mexican crisis today.
I'd buy that for a...
All right, so Ed Neumeyer, thank you for answering questions about RoboCop. I know you've done that before, and thanks for allowing us to do it again. And David Burke, also a great writer who has written for Paul Verhoeven. I thought it would be cool to have David here for us to ambush you.
That's good.
About this great movie. So I know a little bit about your background. It's a generic question. Could you just talk about what kind of made you a writer? Why'd you decide to do this? Like, what was the thing that kind of sparked you when you were a kid?
Well, I think the truth is, like many screenwriters, I was trying to be a writer to please my father, and it didn't work out very well.
Right.
He thought movies were dumb, and so therefore I was going to prove him wrong or right or something. No, my dad was a writer. We were interested in, there was interest in the household in telling stories and stuff like that. So that was something I always had thought about, and I loved movies, so I was attracted to that.
So what did your dad write?
He was a journalist, and he'd written some novels when he was a younger man, and then he was a journalist and a pretty successful journalist, and traveled around the world with that, and then later became a PR guy. So, yeah.
So was there, you're most famous for writing these, the science fiction movies. Was science fiction something from your childhood that bit you, or was that something that came later?
No, it was. When I was a kid, I read a lot of Robert Heinlein and some of those sort of juvenile books, and I read thrillers by Alistair MacLean. And I think Robert Heinlein and Alistair MacLean taught me to write as a kid. B fiction and sort of stuff like that. And I liked science fiction, but I wasn't a real science fiction nerd. What happened was, Star Wars came out, and actually, I lived in Northern California, and Star Wars was made in Northern California. And George Lucas lived in my neighborhood. Right. I did not know him, but that made science fiction pretty interesting to me.
Right.
And I've used it more as a way to do satire than I have to actually do I'm not as interested in world building, but I was more interested in that you could make jokes about things if you were in science fiction.
And yet the world building in RoboCop is amazing, and I think the level of satire, the way that that's woven in, was pretty unprecedented. For instance, when Nick and I were rewatching it recently, I remembered I always loved, particularly the moment where the two corporate executives, and the one guy says to the other guy,
"I'd buy that for $1."
It's like that one hilarious joke cements the whole world that you're in. The 360 nature of the reality.
Well, there's the reality that's put forth in the media breaks or in the news, and when you interact with that, when the characters interact that, it gives you a sense of this whole world, I think.
Yeah.
This is Media Break.
There was one thing I was interested in. I think you mentioned once your parents were pretty much kind of classic, kind of San Francisco liberal type people. And you said this in connection to Starship Troopers, but I think it applies very much to RoboCop also, that there was a little bit of a kind of, getting back at your parents, or kind of like goosing your parents a little bit.
I guess so. I mean, there was. You mean the kind of the fascism? Well, as John Davison, the producer, said, RoboCop is fascism for liberals.
No, that is exactly it. That is exactly it. I remember I was like a little bit of like a kind of proto SJW, as they call it today, back in the day too. And I remember when I watched it, those elements of kind of anti-corporate satire and all that gave me permission to just go with it and love it. But at the same time, and that's what I think is so fascinating about both Starship Troopers and this, is the movie really delivers the goods, even as it does have that critical distance and the satire.
It's fascinating that cops and soldiers love those movies.
Then, okay, so let's talk about you go to film school. You told me that you went pretty quickly from school from being someone who's a working professional in Hollywood. You worked as an executive.
I went from film school, and then I became a reader, and then I became an executive, and then I wrote RoboCop. It was kind of it was like 8 years of development training, and I was briefly a junior executive at Universal under Sean Daniels and when Lew Wasserman was there. So Lew Wasserman was really the idea of the old man.
Yeah. There's a story you've told about where you got the idea for the character, and I think for posterity you should tell it because it's a pretty amazing thing.
Well, is this the Blade Runner thing? Well, so I had an office as a reader next to the Blade Runner set, and we didn't even know it was Blade Runner. It was just this enormous movie that suddenly started shooting. And so I wanted to be on a movie, so I would leave my job as a reader and go work all night on the Blade Runner set. And there was so many people that they would put you to work. And
Really?
And yeah,
You just
so
worked for free?
I just showed up and said, I can do that. And I made garbage on the set. It was trash cans full of paper and water and stuff. But anyway, the most interesting thing about it was I was thinking about this idea about sort of corporate adventures. And in those days, you weren't supposed to do science fiction because it was too expensive as your first movie. And then I was on that set, and there was something really evocative and about set and place. And the idea of the character of RoboCop sprung into my mind, and the title, like it's never happened to me before. So I really think it was Ridley Scott's art direction, and that car and all of that stuff was very inspiring. And so that the idea of a robot policeman who had been trying to figure out why people acted that way was the first idea, and then the next idea was what if he had been a man first.
Right.
And that I think is the central metaphor that makes RoboCop work. Is if he wasn't a man, it wouldn't have been interesting.
Sure, and it's pretty fascinating that you had that idea on the set of a movie. You didn't know you hadn't read the script.
No, in fact, it was like I said to somebody, "What is that? What is this movie about?" And they pointed at Sean Young, who was in a tutu, and they said, "That's a robot." And I was like, "No, that's not a robot." And then so it came out of that in a way.
Yeah, well, it's a kind of a central, theme in Blade Runner, obviously, but in a lot of science fiction and in Frankenstein, the idea of what is a man is a soul what makes us. Even in 2001, A Space Odyssey with Hal, and that's one of the things that among a lot of stuff that you get into in RoboCop that becomes the kind of heart of it, and it's in a way another version of that thing that already existed.
But one of the things that I was trying to do, which was different from Frankenstein and Hal, was I was trying to say this is about coping. This isn't about science fiction is going to kill you. Which is what Hal's about, and what a lot of science fiction had been, technology will kill you. So I said this is about someone who has to cope with it. That was my sort of running theme in writing it, was this is about coping with technology.
Interesting.
So there's something optimistic, I would say, strangely,
I think so.
in all of the dark stuff in RoboCop.
Yeah. Well, certainly it ends in this really optimistic way.
No, and I was just going to say in terms of, I guess I was curious also about the evolution of the character too, because I know like when I worked with Paul Verhoeven on and off on the Jesus thing, he would bring up RoboCop, not infrequently, just in terms of that whole idea of RoboCop as like an American Christ, like Jesus coming with a gun, not in peace.
Well, Miner and I actually knew it was either Christ or Frankenstein.
Right.
Which day did you want? So when we got with Paul, who knew that Paul was a Jesus scholar and would,
right.
But it was kind of perfect, then you got there's several optical moments where at the end he walks on water, and when he's shot to pieces, there's a little bit of a moment of crucifixion there. So it's cool. Yeah, no, that worked out, and I don't know why that.
But that was there originally.
That was always in our intention, but we didn't really. And so when it came up, we would go, we were
not the kind of thing you wanted to talk about, but it was inherently there.
I think we were able to talk about it actually, and just kind of throw it away. Oh yeah, it's Jesus. Right. And Paul was like, oh, it's Jesus, but I don't want you to really. That one moment where Peter does that, it's so well crafted.
Right.
You'd miss it if you didn't see it go by. But even the hand, blowing up the hand and all of that stuff, and it's interesting how these sub themes can operate.
And also, he mentioned to me once, like I mentioned, one of my favorite scenes, maybe my very favorite scene in the movie, is when he visits the old family home.
Same here.
And like he was talking about that in terms of like that's the kingdom of God, basically, that lost world.
He thought of that was Paradise Lost. That scene was Paradise Lost for him, and that was a scene that everybody always just loved in that scene. It's funny because it's just one little scene, and it really gives you all of that stuff. There used to be a dog, but we couldn't afford a dog.
Also we were talking also not to get off topic, but we were also talking about how in a way minimal the family stuff is in the movie.
What I learned as a writer was the worst thing in the world you could do was dwell on that family.
Absolutely.
The wife and the kid, it was nothing but tragedy. And it gets in the way of the real arc of RoboCop, because RoboCop is a man who becomes this machine, and then he reclaims himself. And there was a big debate at the time. The big note was, well, he has to become a man again. And the big revelation for me at the end of writing the process was, oh no, he's not. He's something different. Right. And as Phil Tippett calls him, he's a fantasy creature. And the wife and the kid get in the way of that, I think.
Although it is interesting, the last line of the movie is, they say, what's your name? And he says, Murphy. So,
right.
he does like reclaim his individuality and his humanity to a degree.
To a degree.
At the end, but you're right, but not all the way.
And we let you think it's just lovely, but it's,
right.
so we don't know.
So you go out the door.
Might not have been so good.
They reprogram him the next day. And
So you started to write the script on your own before you started to write it with Michael Meyer?
So I was on from the Blade Runner set on, which was in '81. Right. I kind of wrote outlines and worked on this thing until about '84 or '85, and then I was an executive by that time. And Michael Meyer came in to see me, and I was like already kind of secretly going, I'm not executive material. There's other people who do this better. And he said, I'm directing a movie, a rock video about a robot. And I said, well, funny you should say that. And we started talking, and he said, let's do it. So I had screening privileges at something that no longer exists at Universal. You could have breakfast brought into a screening room and watch anything you wanted.
Anything in their library?
Anything you wanted. I would order weird movies that weren't like Gun Crazy and stuff like that. So we sat and we watched movies and we talked, and eventually this ended up as we sat down and wrote it.
What did you watch?
We watched Gun Crazy was one of them. I can't remember what else I get. I mean, just weird action movies. And we also found that watching movies, even movies you'd seen before, like Godfather or whatever, were really helpful just because it was inspirational. Sure. And it led you to think about movies. And watching a movie screened on a movie lot and you're working on a movie is really fun somehow,
There's the story, of course, that Paul has told many times about that he didn't like the script when he first read it.
No, that's wrong. He didn't read the script.
His wife did.
He didn't. The first time he got the script, he read the title page that said "The Future of Law Enforcement" and threw it over his shoulder. Yeah. And then then someone asked him to read it again for context.
I think he told me Martine.
And then Martine read it, and she said, "You should read this." And he read the scene where they shoot Murphy to pieces, and he said, "Oh, let's get on a plane." And and I think the first draft was well, no, it wasn't the first draft he read. He read the second draft. And then he came and he said, but why is this funny? Now, this was a big problem I had with everyone except John Davison. Mm-hmm. Why is this funny? Even my writing partner, Mike Miner, was like, yeah, but why is it funny? Because I kept putting in funny things. But John Davison knew it could be funny. Paul came in and said, if I make this movie, it's not going to be funny. So I wrote a draft. Paul came back to town and read it in front of me and said, well, I was wrong. We're going back to your original script. And he had since read some comic books, and he realized what we were doing. And I think that would never have happened with an American director. Sure. I think that would have been the end of me.
He would have been humble.
And I would have been out, and he would have hired someone, they would have hired somebody else. But with a European director who believed in that the writer does something, he was very supportive.
And did you bring him those comics?
I gave him, before he left, I gave him some Iron Man comics and some Judge Dredd comics. And I said, you should read these. And I was kind of embarrassed. And he was like, what's this? It seemed like, but he actually did read them. And he went out and bought some others. And when he showed up, he was wearing a Judge Dredd t-shirt, which said, you are being judged on it. And then he would cast people wearing that shirt and go, oh, I did.
Well, I mean, that comic, which I'm not a scholar really of that comic, but I read it back then. I had friends who were really into comics, and and that always felt like, to me, the closest kind of tonal, approximation of RoboCop. In that mixture of, what we were saying before about the kind of fetishy stuff of fascism, while also sending it up, and it being a kind of kick-ass, adventure. And so that kind of mixture, which to me, I saw the movie the weekend it opened, and as a teenager, it made a really huge impact on me because I felt like it kind of combined, the stuff that I'd been thirsting for, specifically violence in movies that I was like kind of obsessed with as someone who loved horror films, but then was so kind of nasty and satirical and directly sending up yuppies, which had become this kind of touchstone in a way,
Right.
as an exhibit A of what kind of was wrong with America. And it kind of felt like some sort of punk B-side to Star Wars or something when I saw the movie. That's how it made me feel. And so, you know, for you guys to kind of get there, and it sounds like it was, you know, that it was always kind of there in the script and that Paul kind of interfaced with it. Like, was there ever any kind of discussion as you were making the movie about the idea that it was this movie that kind of encompassed these kind of, which were kind of underground ideas with something that was overground?
I think John Davison really understood that, and John Davison, you know, came from Corman and came from a real sense of underground films and stuff like that. So he was encouraging all of that. And whenever I would say, "Well, it's really about this," he would go, "Oh, that's good." You know,
it's amazing.
I was running around saying, "Well, this is a lot really about Vietnam." Saying, Ed 209 looks like a Huey helicopter, and Dr. McNamara is based on Robert McNamara, and so there was all of that kind of stuff that was subtext, and he got that, and he would encourage. I think the nice thing about John was he encouraged all that, and he just said, keep going, and occasionally he would have a really good idea that he was never too insisted on.
Right.
And with Paul, he also in the development was very encouraging, but he kind of got it, and he knew that we were doing funny stuff, and he knew, I think in some ways the real bite of the satire is him.
You and I, when we watched the movie the other day, were talking about all those things that kind of defy screenwriting cliche,
Right.
you know, and that there are so many aspects to the movie that you know, as David and I being working screenwriters now, can't imagine, you know, being able to get past an executive. And, you know, with the first example, that being the idea that you don't meet, you know, Murphy's family beforehand. But the structure of the movie is really interesting. It was Rodney Asher, who I introduced you to, and this is Rodney's favorite movie, who talked to me once about this idea that the movie is about these communities of different people. There's the corporate community, there's the criminal, you know, community, there's the community of cops. And in a way, the story is sort of, it's almost like an object lesson in what corporations can do, what shitty things corporations can do to poor people, you know, where you see this decision made at the top, and the movie is really about the ripple effect of that happening through all these different people. And one of the things that really impressed me when I was watching it again is like just how many characters there are in this film. You have this kind of amazing sense of character, even the very small ones that you see for one scene. And I'm curious for some of those small characters, how specific and refined you would get in your writing of the script. And I'm thinking about like even like throwaway characters like, you know, the guy in the gas station with the protractor, you know, like that, where you get in like 20 seconds this whole kind of world of this guy.
But I think that's because, so that's a really good one, because Paul related to that character. Paul was the one who wanted to have him doing geometry, because Paul has a degree in math. And so the idea there was, I think it came off, what are you, a college boy? Yeah. And Paul is, you know, the anti-intellectual idea of the gang, and that so Paul really related to that character in the booth there, and wanted to have him doing the geometry to be a college boy, and all that kind of stuff. And that's why I think it became that character is memorable, because Paul sort of invested in it that way.
Okay, interesting. You know, one of the things that we're tracking in the movie is the kind of, you know, corporate shenanigans, the backstabbing and Bob Morton rising and taking advantage. It's so great, that stuff. And one of the most fun scenes, I think, in the movie is when Dick Jones is in the toilet. That scene when there's the confrontation between Bob Morton and Dick Jones in the bathroom. Did that stuff come from some specific, did it come from you being an executive? Did it come from, you know, another movie that you love?
That came from me being an executive, because there was an executive washroom on the 11th floor at MCA. And the reason I wrote that scene that way was because if you wore a gray suit and you walked out of the bathroom and you had a stain on your pants, all the secretaries could see you. So it was there. So that idea of the stain came from there.
That was in the script?
That was in the script.
And then let's just talk about, since both of you guys have written movies for Paul and actually been there when you're shooting. So, like, it sounds like you were pretty intimately involved with this thing as it was being shot.
I was on the set for all. I was the co-producer, but I was there for the entire time for some reason.
And how creative was your involvement? Were you writing pages as it was going along, or were you?
On RoboCop, I wrote pages ahead of what we were shooting, and I would always try to improve everything. Paul's pretty demanding, and it can be, I think it can be, for other people who are not interested, it can seem a little harsh, because he really wants it to be good.
I was just wondering about what kinds of notes he gave, because from my experience, his notes are actually relatively minimal, and yet then hyper-specific.
Yeah, that's about right. And they were mostly, do I understand this? The one thing I liked working about him was he would really try to understand what you were doing before he decided he didn't like it or not. And sometimes, you could kind of win on something that was right. And we never really had, when he didn't like something, I usually, he's probably right, And occasionally I would go, yeah, I think you should look at this again. And he would go, oh, okay. Mm-hmm. So I think it was probably one of the most creative sets I've ever been on.
Shit! I don't believe it!
I mean, just watching the movie again, it's so breathlessly paced. The camera's always doing something interesting. I kept waiting for a scene to not work or kind of not be up to the level that I was expecting, and it never flags. It's incredible how well it holds up, and of course, it almost goes without saying the prescient nature of your script, the privatization of everything.
I think the pace of the script is something that Paul and I have in years looked back on like, wow, that script doesn't go A, B, C, D. It goes like A, F, K. It just boom. And I don't know, I wish I could still do that, but it was something that was written that way, and Paul really got it that way too.
Yeah, that was one of the things when we were watching it that struck me as one of the unconventional things that you wouldn't be able to get away with now, was also, especially after this blight of everybody reading all Joseph Campbell and all these Joseph Campbell. That is exactly what I'm saying. Yeah. So you were able to kind of zig and zag.
But but wait a second, I didn't read Joseph Campbell, but years later I did when everybody was. And then I looked back and I went, RoboCop is like Joseph Campbell. It's like hits every note. But
but it doesn't hit every note in the same
not in a cheesy way. That's true. That's true.
Yeah, no, and in fact, just like even how absent your protagonist is for so much of the movie is really interesting. Even the way that then he's kind of characterized, for instance, the scene where he kind of first becomes conscious and everything's going haywire, that's ordinarily the scene in a science fiction or a horror movie where things are bad.
It's not dwelling on how horrible it is for him. For some reason. Also, the other thing about RoboCop is a character that is defined by the other characters around him better than if you just spend a lot of time with him, I think.
When he shoots through the woman's legs and shoots the guy in the balls, was that in the script?
The original, no, that was Paul.
I thought so.
Paul came to the set with that idea. Originally, it was going to be, I think in the script it was that he shoots past her cheek and hits her and hits the guy. And he came up with this whole idea of this. And the nice thing that Paul would do was he wouldn't tell you what he was doing. He would just come to the set and do it. And so there was kind of this, oh my God, look what's happening. And it was great, It was wonderful. And then that last shot, the way that shot worked was kind of a miracle, and the guy falling down and all that kind of stuff was great.
Well, and that scene was so strong when I saw that movie on opening weekend. And it kind of induced a kind of hysteria in the audience when I saw it. And it's because when he does shoot her through her dress, there's this moment, it's about 1 second when you think he has shot her in the crotch. Right. And then when you realize that he's been shot, you're simultaneously having this feeling of kind of elation and surprise, as well as just the horror of someone being shot in their dick, and all those things come together. And actually in that sequence, as a filmmaker, one of the things that I think is hilarious about that scene is there's like a jump cut, this thing that by then you're not supposed to be doing, but it's on the actress who plays the victim of the assault, where she's freaking out, and then all of a sudden she runs to RoboCop. It's a cut that should not work, but it works, I think, because you're still reeling in this moment of how inventive and just bizarre and violent it is.
And I think it also works because it's like a cheesy B-movie idea that she has to go up and you were willing
hug
to
him.
to accept that for some reason. And Paul, I think, understood that. And sometimes he would say, "Oh, let's do this shot like it's like on the new stuff. There's bad stuff on purpose." And so he's good that way.
Well, then to touch on kind of the tone that's in the movie that goes from that sort of hard violence, from some really great dramatic scenes like with the cops or in the corporate world. There's stuff in the movie like when Emil melts via the toxic waste that is so ridiculous, and John Davidson coming from the world of Corman, maybe that is part of that world, but was that always built into the script? The fact that
Oh yeah. In fact, my favorite gag is that gag of the thing going into the tank and the guy being washed out in the back, because it's all very kinetic. And that moment when he gets hit by the car was the highest rated. The audience loves that.
That was the thing they liked the most.
They loved that moment the most, and the MPA was like, "Oh, you have to take the sound effect off of that because it was just
so disgusting." And I love that Ray Wise in that scene is like, "Get away from me!"
I know.
Also, just the amount of squibs and stuff like that. That was
famous
not
for that, yeah.
what they were doing at that moment. Like Peckinpah had been like 20 years earlier or something. It seems like by the 80s, everything was pretty bloodless.
Yeah, I
And-
don't know.
and-
I mean,
and
we
th- and
both
this
really
was
liked
really
Blood,
going
and,
over-
and I was
yeah,
really into
yeah,
that. The idea
yeah.
that we were doing, I actually wired squibs on that movie.
Oh, wow.
All the when they're shooting RoboCop up in the parking garage, I wired some of those squibs.
Films already were, by the 80s, were entertaining some pretty severe violence. Watching it today, it embraces a lot of 80s action tropes like the shootout in a
The big shootout at the end.
In the abandoned
the
factory
abandoned
and all
factory, the cocaine factory, or just the fact that it's like a multiracial gang.
Right.
That's very much part of this kind of like, I don't know, like a Death Wish sequel aesthetic that's kind of like sitting in the movie. And I think in some ways that has dated the movie in a kind of positive way, because those things kind of have ended up kind of complementing everything else that's so unique in the film.
In a way, I almost think it was very much ahead of its time in that way, and this is also a thing that's like a deliberate amorality in a way is kind of a thing for Paul, and that's definitely there in this
Absolutely,
material from
and
the
you
beginning.
enjoy it, yeah.
And what I think is great is, and this is also what really distinguished RoboCop from the other action movies at the time, when there was Stallone or Chuck Norris or whatever. There was always like a very serious kind of righteousness to the violence, always, which it makes it more troublesome to me. But in this, that with the excess of the blood, the excess of the comic book nature, the violence and everything, it was like
Well,
kind
it
of,
takes it to absurdity, is what it does.
Exactly.
So, and I think absurdity is more the theme that we were after than righteousness.
Right.
We couldn't take it
That's
that
right.
seriously.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
You go through the process of shooting with Paul, and then he's cutting it. When was the first time that you saw the film?
Well, I remember we both saw the rough cut, and we were both like,
You and Michael?
no, Paul and I.
Oh, okay.
And yeah, Michael had gone off to make another movie at this point, so it was mostly just Paul and John and I. And I was still writing the media break stuff, and I also ended up writing all the ADR, so I was writing and writing and writing. But when we saw the rough cut, it was all the things rough. I'd never seen a rough cut before. It was just horrible. I remember Paul was like white. It wasn't that bad, but it wasn't that different. It was just no sound. And so in any event, we saw it, and then I watched it with sound after that. It slowly built and music, and suddenly it was the movie that you've seen. But the first time you saw it, it was of course terrible. And RoboCop sounded like he was walking on toilet blenders.
When did you watch it with an audience?
We watched it with an audience at MGM in the big mixed stage there. And the first time I saw it, it was really interesting because the audience started laughing immediately. And I realized something about audiences. They really want to like your movie.
Yeah.
And they'll give you anything. And if you don't lose them, they're yours. I remember somebody walked out of the theater saying, "This is the most terrible movie I've ever seen. This is horrible. All those people are dying and they're laughing." The first cut was much gorier. and there was a problem with the rating, and there was a problem with the audience because it was so gory. So much blood on the floor, it looked like a abattoir or a butcher shop. And so we actually literally cut out the floor. And we cut out a couple little things, and that made a difference with the audience. And then there were a few more things that had to come out for the MPAA, but not that much actually.
Right. And so then, when the movie was released in the summer of '87, like you have been through this whole creative process, like making this movie, and this is like your first produced film. What was that opening weekend like?
Well, it was exhausting because you've seen a movie, as you know, 40 or 50, 100 times, and you're like sick of it. And I remember saying, I'm not even going to go see it in a theater. I've had it, Well, actually, a funnier thing happened. The day it came out, I had lunch and a meeting with Paul, some other project that we were going to try to do. And then we all left. And then I went, instead of going to my car, I walked over back to the Bruin Theater where I knew it was going to play to see if there was a line for the first thing. And then I look over across the street and there's Paul standing there.
Yeah, he told me that story.
Yeah, no, it was really sweet.
That he actually went with the kids, and then he was. I'm probably stepping on your story.
No.
Because he told me that he went with the kids, and then he was totally demoralized because there was nobody out in front of the theater. Then he talked to the girl at the box office, and she said that there was nobody there because it was like all sold out.
Sold out, yeah. No, so that we heard I remember hearing from. I was in Mike Medavoy's office that day. And he said he had said, oh, he had somebody on the phone. He said, oh, listen to this, and he hit the speaker button, and there was a guy standing in a payphone going, they're coming out of the theater, and everybody likes it. It's amazing. It's a hit. And it was like, well, you'd never hear that kind of thing. And so that night, I actually went to the Bruin with some friends, and it was pretty overwhelming because I had never seen it. And when he said Murphy, the audience roared in a way I've never heard before, and it was like. It was wow. And then suddenly, you were on. And it was a big hit, and that was, as Kipling says, triumph and defeat are the same imposters.
Thank you so much for yakking about this, and
pleasure.
David, for you contributing. It's an honor to know you guys and to hang out and hear your stories about working with Paul, and then being able to talk to you about what is one of my favorite movies of all time.
We should start a show where we just talk about movies. Just the three of us.
Okay. Tune in next week.